All right, everybody, welcome to Virtual Bourbon. My name is Steve Akeley. We have a fun event tonight. We're going to be trying the products from Stoll and Wolf. We have Eric Wolf joining us here today. Hey, Eric, how you doing, man?
Doing great. Happy to be here.
Absolutely. We'll get to know a little bit more about you and about your company. And of course, we'll get to your great products and taste for these things, including Rose and Rye. And we will be getting into the historical significance of that as well as we chat through this. And of course, one of our other presenters will be calling upon her as we talk about that Rose and Rye. Laura Fields, who started an organization called the Delaware Valley Fields Foundation, and she'll be telling us all about that. Hey, Laura, how you doing?
Good. How you doing, Steve?
Good, good. So yeah, you can tell us exactly how this Rose and Rye thing came about and all that.
Sure.
And then of course we've got a fellow distiller here. We've got Royce Neely, who famously road tripped with me up to Pennsylvania to meet Dick Stoll, and we met Eric Wolf there as well. First time any experience with that, and just have Royce here, just kind of because Dick Stoll for the remainder of his life played an important role with Royce, helped him out with several things, answered his phone every time he called and stuff like that. So we'll talk a little bit, obviously, with the perspective from Eric, who's partnered with Dick Stoll and what he meant to him. But then we'll talk to somebody even on the periphery, somebody who just through a casual conversation led to this friendship that lasted about the last 18 months of Mr. Stoll's life. So, hey, Royce, how you doing, man?
Good, buddy.
Good. And then my co-presenter, the person who helped put this together, Leah Niskanen, she is joining me as well. Hey, Leah, how are you doing?
Very well, thank you.
Good, good. So the two of us will kind of tag team here on asking questions to our panel as we go through this thing, okay? All right. Well, I think we want to start this out with Eric. And Eric, I know a lot about your company, and maybe people have researched it a little bit, and you have done an event with us in the past where they've got to know your company. You've been on the Bourbon Show as well, but I think it's still a good idea to go ahead and explain to us about your background and how you got the company going and all that stuff, okay?
Sure. Sounds good. So yeah, it seems like again forever ago and yesterday. But my wife and I were actually living in Brooklyn. I'm from Lancaster County originally, and the local and slow food movement was sort of taking hold in New York, and people were beginning to, at least to my knowledge, research some of the local food traditions from the areas that they came from. And growing up in Lancaster County, there is a very religious, sort of puritanical approach here. So the local whiskey history had sort of become buried. Wasn't something anybody had spoken about. And once I started doing a little bit of research about what made our area so special, I realized that according to the National Register of Historic Places, just a few miles up the road was the birthplace of American whiskey as an industry. So basically the first folks that had a mill and would have said year round, when you asked them what they do for a living, they would have said we're distillers. So that was sort of eye-opening to me, and the kind of thing where I realized that what was even crazier was that there was a gentleman who was part of that legacy and part of that lineage that was still living. And what was even crazier was that nobody was working with him. So when we first met Dick, all credit due to local historian and local whiskey geek and friend, Ethan Smith. When I first met Dick, I expected almost like when a student climbs a mountain to meet a Zen master, that there would be just a long line of people waiting to get wisdom from this gentleman. And turns out there wasn't. He'd actually,
yeah.
It really is. I mean, it's still mind blowing to this day. People often ask, well, what made Dick Stoll pick you guys? And I have to be honest and say, well, we're the only ones who asked. So yeah, so let that be a lesson to all of us that the worst anyone can say is no. But speaking with Dick, there was just an instant bond there, and I think he thought we were probably a little crazy, which you have to be to start a distillery.
Yeah,
you have to be too dumb to not know how hard it is, and too crazy to know when to quit. So with meeting Dick, my grandfather had passed about a year before I was born. My father's father. I had never had a chance to meet him, but turns out Dick was born almost 2 or 3 months to the day from when my grandfather was born. They did similar tours in the Navy during the Korean War. We're on this similar cruise from one another. So just to have that personal experience, and it's interesting because you mentioned how Royce would call Dick and ask for, not that I'm hopefully I'm not giving away any trade secrets, Royce, but that you would occasionally call Dick for some advice. And Steve, you said, well, Dick would take his call.
Right.
Not only would Dick take his call, Dick would be so excited that Royce called, and then I would hear about it the next day, and then Elaine his wife would tell me about it. And it's the kind of thing where Dick was so happy to share and just so excited that people wanted to learn the knowledge that he had. There was a time when Michter's closed, Pennsylvania Michter's, that he was working in construction, and it was his mid-50s that he had already worked very hard, but to go out and start doing construction in your mid-50s is a feat unto itself. And then after that, he was working as a custodian in a local elementary school. So to have somebody with that much knowledge and that link to such a historic legacy, almost lose that knowledge to history, was to me a very it was something that I immediately identified with, and something that I felt was the mission that we needed to undertake, but also something where when you're working with another human being who's in their 80s, you know that your time is limited, as is all of our time. But the most amazing thing about Dick was, with as much knowledge as he had to impart, he also had limitless patience, and never once made us felt like we weren't getting enough of what he was teaching, or that anything we did wasn't worthy of his time or interest, or that it was all part of the process and all part of what he had to teach. So it was really, I used to tell him he was our Yoda. And he would point out he wasn't quite as old as Yoda. So that was, but no, he really just, and was somebody from another era that not only did he become a grandfather figure, which again, he would say father figure, which is totally cool. I will happily accept that. But also somebody who, when he started making whiskey, nobody cared who the distiller was. They just cared what the whiskey was in the bottle, and nobody cared about the personalities behind the whiskey, or even really what type of still was being used, or what care the producers were putting into it. It was seen as much more of an industrial industry. So for him to have worked his way up from barreling through maintenance to actually learning to distill, his attention to detail, his love of craft, his just dedication to the spirit he was producing is something that I don't think he ever fully got over people wanting to meet him. That they, when people would talk about A.H. Hirsch, or they would talk about the things that happened, I mean, he was working as a custodian in elementary school when the most expensive whiskey that ever came out to date was released. So for him, I think it was a very surreal experience, and the kind of thing where he just was just so almost amused by it all. I mean, he was so thankful that he was able to pass on that knowledge, and hopefully we're doing honor to that legacy. But I think just the sort of almost celebrity status that he attained was always more amusing to him than anything else, mostly because he was such a humble guy. Yeah. So for us, it's one of those things where we miss him so terribly, both as a member of the family and to be able to turn to him and ask his thoughts and feelings on what we're bottling and what we're distilling. But we do feel thankful in that Dick was definitely the kind of guy who, if I would have blubbered or waxed sentimental about any of these things, he would have just jokingly said, "Get the hell back to work." Right. So for me, to be able to get the hell back to work and make more whiskey is almost a meditative practice that I can't think of a better way to honor him than to continue to produce whiskey the way that he taught us how. So for us, it's both a huge honor, and then also the kind of thing where we can't mess it up. That's a huge responsibility as well. So I think it's something that we definitely take very seriously, and something that is a huge labor of love for us as
Yeah.
well.
You know,
So-
Eric,
So, sorry, go ahead.
I just wanted to follow up on one thing, and because as you're talking about those things, Eric, I do want to think that there's just something special about Dick Stoll and whiskey, because what I mean by that is, there's always this thing, a person's a person, they put their pants on the same way, one leg at a time, all that kind of stuff. But when it comes to whiskey, there was something unique about Dick Stoll in that, because when Royce and I met with him, you're talking about being out of the business for 30 years. Now, if I've been out of my corporate job for 4 years, if they threw me back in there tomorrow, I wouldn't remember any of it. I wouldn't know the processes. I wouldn't know what we were talking about, what we were doing 4 years ago. We talked to Dick Stoll some 30 years after he had made, whiskey for Michter's, and he remembered everything down to the pH levels and balances and how to make the yeast and what the yeast room was. He remembered literally everything, like there was a blueprint in his mind of all this stuff.
Well, and to your point, it's interesting you say blueprint. When he got out of the Korean War, he was in the Navy, and he was a mechanic. They weren't quite jets at that point, but they were the forerunner of jets. So he was working as a mechanic on those. So some of the most advanced technology in the world at that point. When he got out of the Korean War, there was a lot of unemployment because there were so many people returning to the workforce, and a lot of folks who'd entered the workforce to fill the void during the war. He was sent by the local unemployment office to help dig a ditch as his first job back. So going from some of the most advanced technology in the world as a mechanic to helping dig the ditch. After the week of digging the ditch, the foreman said to him, he's like, you showed up every day on time, you worked really hard, and you weren't drunk. This is actually the foundation of an old distillery that's reopening. Would you want to work here now that we're reopening? So that's how Dick got his start in there. And my point in telling that story is he approached digging ditches the same way he approached fixing jets, essentially, which was work really hard and let your work speak for you. And so he worked his way from being in the barreling crew up through maintenance, ultimately became the head of maintenance. And one day Charlie Beam said to him, hey, you show up every day, you show up on time, and you're not drunk. Apparently drunkenness on the job was a big problem back then. So that said, most of success in life is showing up, and apparently,
not showing up drunk.
In the 50s and 60s also was. So that said, and maybe that's why the other folks actually aren't showing up. They were just too intoxicated.
Right.
Anyway.
Well, I mean, one of the, just to both of your points, right? I've represented a lot of craft distillers for a long time, and I'm always fascinated by this skill set, this completely unique skill set that all of the distillers I've ever met or worked with have. And there's kind of no template for that. So I wanted to sort of address you, Eric, about that and say, if you were to kind of come up with a skill set for distillers based upon what you just talked about, I mean, what would that be? And also, I mean, do you think there's ever a point where there's such a thing as mastery?
That's a great question. Well, and I think with Dick's approach to all of it, and I think the reason he knew so much and could go back to it like he had never left was because he knew every valve in there, and he knew how every piece of equipment worked. So Lee, I think to your question, curiosity is the biggest and most important thing, because ultimately, if there's that great quote about if you pull on any strand, ultimately the whole universe unravels.
Right.
And basically, if you just follow everything back and say, okay, well, I need to learn about steam now. Cool.
Right.
Well, I'm going to learn about steam. Well, then that involves learning about boilers. Well, that involves learning about water chemistry.
So
well,
a hunger for knowledge.
That's exactly it. And Dick was the first to admit that he was always learning, and he ever felt like he learned it all, it would have ceased to be interesting to him. So I think with so much of it, it's the ability to ask questions and just keep asking those questions and keep figuring out why it works that way. And I think with every distillery, there's quirks, there's weird little things, and it always works a certain way.
Yeah.
Sometimes it doesn't, and then it doesn't work that way. And your ability to just adjust. We always laugh that there's excuse me, I won't be able to make the reference exactly, but there's the one fashion designing show where they talk about it, it's make it work time. And we say it's always make it work time in distilling. There's always
Project Runway. I'm a
Thank
big
you.
fan.
Sorry about that. It was much cooler if I knew that right off the bat, but yes,
Yeah.
Project Runway. So with distilling, it's always make it work time, where you
Yeah.
can't leave until it's done. And with what Dick taught us as well, there's a certain dedication to craft, and you don't, the fermentation is not finished properly, you're not distilling it. If you're not done mashing, you're not going anywhere until that's finished. And my wife, we refer to her as a distillery widow because she frequently loses me to the distillery, but I go down after we pitch the yeast a few hours later because I want to see the fermentation happening, and I want to see the size of the bubbles and smell I'm a weird person like that, but I think most distillers are like that. It's the kind of thing where it becomes your child, a member of your family. Where I know that they talk about the old time distillers, and I'm sure Royce can confirm this. That the Jonah jugs they would keep next to their bed.
Right.
Mostly so that they could tell if they were uncomfortable, they would know the yeast was uncomfortable.
Yeah.
But also if there was a fire, or there was anything else, that was one of the first things someone was grabbing, because it was so important. It was so vital to. So I think with distilling, it's a lifestyle. It's a career, but it's really a lifestyle that if you're into it, just almost pervades every aspect of what you do. But my 11-year-old daughter is so tired of me everything back to chemistry and distilling, and she was so excited to tell me the other day that one of her friends said that beaver anus tastes like vanilla. I know this because it was an old time flavoring, and if you listen to me,
I'm sure that went over really well in high school.
Yeah. Well,
I just wanted to read you something really I'm so fascinated about these the traits of the distillers. I just want to quote from you from Colin Spillman's book Dead Distillers, about what he thinks the traits of distillers are, both historically and just from what he's garnered. And he says, though disparate in historical and geographical circumstance, distillers often share common traits: humble beginnings, fierce industriousness, ostracism from prevailing society, personal reinvention, which I know is part of your story, a propensity for exaggeration, a contrarian spirit, indomitable energy, superstition, social insecurity, and a surprisingly common affinity for fast horses. And that, of course, references distillers from the 19th century. But I thought that was a pretty interesting description. Having known distillers in my life, right? It's ring true to you, and any of those ring true.
So many, and I think the superstition is, distillers are so superstitious because it's so systemic.
Yeah.
And in reality, we don't 100% know why it does that.
Right.
But we know that we did something and now it changed, and that's bad. So we go back to whatever we did before and try to undo that. So it becomes a very superstitious process. And it also, the weather matters. The changes in pressure matter. So in certain ways, you almost become an alchemist.
Exactly.
Which sounds crazy and sort of hippy dippy, but it's true. Distillers are very practical people as well. And that's the beauty of some of the knowledge that gets passed down, or most of the old time knowledge, is that if it doesn't work, it doesn't get passed down. And the things that work are the things that we continue to do. And I know you also mentioned sort of multiple character traits that could sort of be identified as iconoclastic in a way.
Yeah,
Where so
Yeah,
much of it,
exactly.
you just have to make something that nobody is going to be able to taste for years and
Right.
put your entire livelihood and your families on the line
Exactly.
and say that, well, the thing that I do slightly differently is worth risking everything for.
Mhm.
And there's always going to be people that tell you what you do sucks. It doesn't matter what you do.
Right.
You could be the greatest at what you do. People hate Tom Brady. So again, make of that what you will. I'm an Eagles fan, so I like the history. But that said, it's the kind of thing where you just have to have the strength of your convictions and just know that what you're doing is worth continuing to do. And
Yeah.
the whiskey doesn't just fall out of the sky. It takes a lot of work to make. So to continue doing that in the face of dwindling cash flow and
Great odds.
term and all those odds, it
Mhm.
just takes a certain, I always joke, it takes a strong back and a weak mind. But it really does help sometimes.
Yeah, well, I mean, I found that there's a commonality, at least with the distillers that I've worked with, that it's definitely, one of the things Colin mentioned was, that, you have transitioned, people that have transitioned from a job they felt was going to be their career, like you did when you were in New York City, and like the gentleman I'm working with now, who, you're both in positions of kind of corporate positions in New York City, and then just had a lightning bulb go off in your head about how you wanted to transition back to working with your hands and making something instead of pushing paper. Does that make
No,
sense?
it definitely does. And we just had the good fortune to visit a friend and colleague of ours, Steve Bayshore, down at Mount Vernon.
Yeah, I'm following that
which
story.
was so phenomenal. And at one moment when we were down there, a few folks had stepped outside. A few folks were about to come back in. It was about a 10-second period in the evening. And I had one of the old mash rakes and was rowing some mash. And it was just
Wow.
making this repetitive sound. And the only thing in there that wasn't period was me. So they came back in, and it was like, just for a few seconds, I went back in time. And just to sort of have that kinship with those same people, part of our label says united by purpose across time.
Mm.
And the idea that anyone who picks up that mash rake, anyone who stands in front of a still, anyone who is involved in the process in any way is in certain ways part of this fraternity, or part of this group of people that it is alchemy in a certain way. It's transformative, and then it gets to be shared with the people around you, oftentimes at very important times in their life, either celebrations or sort of passings or rites of passage. So to have that ability to work with your hands and create something that connects you so deeply with the past, but then allows you to share the conviviality of the present with folks is really, I can't imagine doing anything else. When we were down there, we were joking that we took a vacation to work harder for free, but it was it was so amazing. It's, some people want to go to a beach and relax, and I enjoy that too. But I'd rather get filthy and covered with mash and smell like smoke and help make whiskey the old-fashioned way. It's it really is a team sport in so many ways as well. So
Cool. So if you don't mind, and normally it's always a distiller's choice how we kick off the tastings, but we got to start with the Rosenberg. You got to have a clean palate with that,
sure.
no doubt. So if you don't mind, and Eric and Laura, maybe if you two collectively could tell the story of how this came back, because I think it would be a disservice just to open it up and taste it. We really got to hear that story of how this came back, where, the start of it all the way through. Laura, what you had to do, and then of course, then Eric's distilling with Mr. Stoll, of course, too. So.
and all credit is due to Laura starting it, so she should certainly be
Okay.
the one.
Well, I was going to say the opposite because it's actually, it was entirely due to the interest that Eric and Dick had in recreating those old Michter's recipes. And obviously, like Eric was saying, he had a very, you know, vivid memory of what those recipes were and wanted to recreate those. And I was actually traveling across Pennsylvania on one of my many trips across the state to go meet people and shake hands and learn about the distillers and the farmers and the maltsters and the millers and everybody else. And was lucky enough to be able to see Eric when he wasn't in the distillery. I was able to meet him at his house, which was cool. And we sat down and talked. And one of the things he mentioned, because I always ask people, you know, who source, or where do you source your grain? Who provides your grain? It's one of the big questions I'm always looking at. And he's like, well, you know, we get it from these folks. And what we really want is to be able to get rosin, because that was, you know, the grain that was used in those Michter's mash bills. And I was like, well, you know, I've read about this, but I haven't actually done all the legwork yet to see if it's out there anywhere. So we basically shook hands and I went home and started researching and, you know, found a couple locations that claimed to have it, but nobody did. It was like on their website, but then, you know, they didn't have any to show for it. So it came down to where I was like, well, the Seed Spark project that I want to kick off, this is perfect, because here's a grain that we know for a fact was magical in whiskey. Otherwise, Michter's wouldn't have used it. So, you know, the proof was already there. So it wasn't like I was starting from scratch. We got the seed from the USDA seed bank, these tiny little 5-ounce packets. And when I say we, actually the Penn State Agricultural Extension and Greg Roth had the packet. I got my own packets and planted them in my backyard as well, just to see, you know, what some differences were. I'm always up for an experiment. And he had about a baggie's worth, because apparently they had planted some in a greenhouse. And, you know, I ran straight to him and was like, what are you doing with the seed? Give it to me, you know? And he's like, we're not doing anything with it. We're not going to plant it again. You know, it costs money to do this stuff. And I was like, well, how much you need? He told me, and I cut him a check, and we started that year. So that was 2016.
That's cool.
And we've been planting every year since. And, you know, it was the support of knowing that Eric and Dick were at the other end wanting to buy this stuff. So it wasn't like I'm asking farmers to do work that, you know, there was nobody with interest at the other end for it. So we just worked every year, taking notes, making sure that we knew, because this is all part of a research project. We're not just planting this stuff to, you know, grow it and distill it. We want it to be a successful crop going forward. So,
so
yeah,
Laura, was that that was first, I guess, came from Russia to Michigan? Is that the right?
well,
Am I
sort
following the
of.
right path? Like I kind of heard that it came first from the student Russia, and then came to this Manitou
Yes.
Island, Michigan, and
Well, Rosen was a student at the University of Michigan. He was an agronomist actually back in Russia.
okay.
And as a student, he was actually asked by the school to go home and ask his father for some of the
Oh,
seed.
wow.
So he
amazing.
went home, retrieved it, went back, and they started growing it, I guess, in 1908. By 1912, they were ready to, you know, give it out and allow farmers to start growing it. But what happened is, over the course of 5 to 7 years, the seed started losing its properties, because at that time in the early 1900s, many people were growing rye, and rye is a very difficult cross-pollinator. You know, the pollen really does blow miles and miles. You know, you talk about open pollinated corn, this is way worse. Rye will really cross with any other rye in the vicinity. So that started to happen. And over, you know, about 3 or 4 years, the crop will just change. That's also how you get landrace grains, which is another thing entirely. But they were concerned that the grain was losing the qualities that it had that everybody loved so much. So what they did then is they isolated it in this family called the Hertzlers on Manitou Island.
Right.
They became basically the seed stock base. That's so they grew seed stock that was pure, and then other people could buy seed stock from them. So it's not like Michigan was supplying the world with rosin. What they were doing was supplying clean, pure seed stock. And so, lots of companies do that. Lots of seed companies will say, you can only supply, you can only buy from us. It's kind of what they were doing.
So, and then how did it end up being grown in Pennsylvania? I mean, what was that trajectory like?
Well, it would have been
that
the same as
Eric
anywhere
would
else.
have access to that.
Early 1900s, it was grown around the world. It wasn't just Michigan. Pennsylvania was growing it, Michigan was growing it, Ohio was growing it. I mean, it was being grown all over the world and all over the country. But if you found that after a couple of years it was losing its character, you could go back and buy new seed stock from Michigan and replant.
Got it.
Mhm.
Got it.
So Eric, then you've got it. And so tell us a little bit about, this first run when you're going through and making that and how excited Dick was to be able to do this. Give us some insight into what it was like making the whiskey then.
Sure. So for us, it was a very exciting day. It was also one of those days where we were aware of the historical significance. So we'd invited some media to come in, which was fantastic to have them document it. But for those of you that have been to our distillery, it is a very tight space. So for us, it was fantastic. But it was a little bit of a dance in the beginning to sort of get the choreography going, and so exciting. The longest moment of my life was when I handed Dick the hydrometer flask, and he took a sip and he smiled. And that moment in between when he took the sip and smiled, it was like they talk about your life flashing before your eyes. It was a little bit like that. So yeah,
it's actually literally in my case, because I'm sitting there going, all right, this is 5 years of my life. Please tell me that this is going to be worthwhile.
Well, and that's the amazing thing with the revival of some of these grains is and traditions is that there's so much lead time with farming. I think a lot of folks we're so removed from our food source, and there's been so many books written about how that's happened over time. But it was amazing to have people ask us immediately after we did the rosin, when are you going to do another batch? And we were very clear to explain to people that we only had those 500 pounds to distill. And it was a great ordeal to get to that point. And we were thankful that Laura and Greg Roth had spent those 5 years prior to even doing that. And then we would explain to them, well, the next growing season. So they were like, well, when's that? And then you explain to people that rye goes into the ground in the winter. And then they look at you like you're insane and have no idea what farming is. And then you have to explain to them that rye actually overwinters in the ground and sort of explain all of it. But there's so much lead time with the agriculture aspect and then with the whiskey as well. So what's really exciting, I think this evening and even in the infancy of the Keystone Rosin Revival is that people ask us what's different about the rosin, and we'll talk about that in a little bit, but the real years, and we'll be able to give you a much clearer answer, mostly because maybe the last year, maybe the rosin that we're about to taste was the best growing season in the last 100 years for rosin. Maybe it was the worst. Good news is this is going to be the best rosin rye you guys have ever had this evening. However, it's also going to be the worst rosin rye you've ever had. It's the sample of one. So it's an exciting time to be involved in the craft whiskey revival, but it's also an exciting time to be involved in the revival of some of these grains as well, mostly because we're still learning as it goes as well. And in some ways, I think everyone here is old enough to get the reference, but it's like a Polaroid that we're still sort of waving and having developed. What we see so far is fantastic, but we're really excited to see how future growing seasons go, how it exhibits different terroir in the different fields where it's being grown, and then also how it performs in different still configurations.
Plus
whether it,
I mean, the machinery and the techniques of farming have changed so much themselves, as Laura, you more than well know, over the past 100 years, that like it changes, that probably changes. And I'm a complete neophyte when it comes to farming, but I'm assuming that changes the way the grain grows and tastes quite a bit. So the century-old techniques that were used maybe in Russia and the Scandinavia and Germany before it came here are very much different than what we're using now. So I mean,
That's all.
there's, yeah,
Yeah,
so many.
that's all part of our research going forward too. Like one of the things that Pennsylvania, this is something that I'm trying to prove now with the help of Mike Swanson, actually up at Far North Spirits, because he's up in the Red River Valley where a lot of this rosin was grown for Michter's. And so I'm trying to determine, why was Michter's still using local rosin as opposed to rosin from, the Red River Valley and from Michigan. And I'm finding just from farming practices, there's a practice called swathing, which is where they cut the grain down in the field and allow it to dry in the field, much like you'd see hay drying in the field and turned. Up in Michigan and up in Canada, they'll swath and let it lay down in the field. Well, in Pennsylvania, we can't do that. We have late rainy seasons, so you'd end up with that grain rotting in the field if you did that, or the risk of it. So I'm looking at the difference between letting grain sit on the stalk for those extra few weeks and really draw all the sugars out into the grain berry. And so here you have an improved crop quality in Pennsylvania as opposed to what would be grown up north.
That's so interesting. And from what I learned from Eric when I visited you, Eric, up in this past summer, you were talking about how your area of Pennsylvania is like one of or the only non-irrigated farmland in the US. Could you talk about that and how that affects farming?
Sure.
I don't know what that means.
The most productive non-irrigated farmland in all of America. So in California, they produce more, but they obviously have to bring in water from the outside. And then also in Florida, they produce quite a bit, also heavily irrigated. So our area, my ancestors were very lucky. We have a farm that's been in the family for over 275 years. Still farmed by my cousins today. Actually, we just mashed some rosin rye that was grown on that farm, which is pretty exciting. So sort of another chapter in that journey. But our area has very rich soil. The soil here is almost cocoa brown. It looks like certain parts of like Piemonte, almost in Italy. So we have very rich soil and a long agricultural tradition. So when the Germans, Swiss, German, French folks that were our ancestors came over, corn would not have been something they would have even known. It was a new world crop. I don't know how much it was grown in Germany at that time. So when they came here, rye would have definitely been something that they knew, something that they were comfortable with. And rye whiskey was one of those things where, forgive me if I'm repeating things that everyone heard, but prior to Prohibition, if you were sort of a sophisticated drinker in the North, rye, which again, coming out of Prohibition, obviously that all changed, but it's amazing how much of that history did exist. And then the other interesting thing with getting farmers to grow some of the rye or even look at some of the heritage grain are the differences in yield that we basically have to make up for. So when we're dealing with some of these heritage grains, they obviously yield much less, but the flavor is what we're seeking. So with that, you could have genetically modified corn where people are getting 200 to 300 bushels an acre. So, and they can get that in let's say 90 days. We have to convince them to take that same field and plant it for 9 months and get 45 bushels an acre. So there's certain economics too that from the producer side, we have to stand up and sort of show that there's value in that as well. And on the consumer side, folks have already shown that they see the value there. So.
Yeah. Well, Eric, why don't we, if you haven't done so already, pour that rose and rye. And
Sure.
and again, you can start nosing it, folks. Share those nosing notes in the chat. And Eric, tell us a little bit about what we might expect as we are starting the process of getting to taste this.
So with the Rosen, it's unlike any other rye that we've produced, or unlike other ryes I've had the chance to taste. Where I'll quote Lisa Wicker. She said and I can't get the phrase out of my mind, but that it tastes like somebody rolled rye around in sugar, and it's got these lavender notes to it
Oh,
that I
definitely.
don't. Yeah, I don't know where they come from or how we did that, but I'm assuming the grain. Our other ryes don't turn out that bad. So it's so floral, and the nice thing with a white whiskey is that you're not getting any influence from the barrel, which the barrel does add characteristics that we all enjoy and does make a very nice aged whiskey. But to taste a white whiskey and to see what the grain imparts, what the still imparts, what the yeast impart is always a really nice a nice opportunity.
Yeah. What's anybody else getting out there? I said there's quite a bit going on there, and it's very different because it's, the sweetness of, I put out there bubble gum. I mean, it's that kind of super sweet on the nose.
Do you get a juicy fruit bubble gum, or what type of bubble gum do you happen to get? Because juicy fruit's one we hear quite a bit.
Yeah, I think it's juicy fruit. Yeah, which is official tasting note for us. So yes, I'd say that's definitely juicy fruit, and then the rye bread, and but I also get those floral notes you're talking about too. So,
And our yeast is we use the same yeast on this that we use on our flagship ryes, and it definitely has. I hate to fall back on the term, but a lot of rye spice. A lot of folks sort of break that down into allspice, some cinnamon, a little bit of clove, and I hate to overuse the term, but when people say that they like pumpkin pie flavor, pumpkin doesn't really have a flavor, but all those other baking spices that go into it do. So in a lot of ways, some of those baking spices, the chai spices that come through as well.
yeah. Well, let's give this thing a taste. Cheers, gang. Here we
Cheers,
go.
everybody. To Dick Stoll.
To Dick Stoll. I agree.
Yes, 100%.
Mm. Oh, wow.
Holy cow. Yeah, definitely get that bubble gum, but there's even some grape there in the taste. I mean,
And hopefully nice and oily on the palate.
yeah,
We don't chill filter.
Very.
We do filter slightly, but non-chill filter.
yeah.
Which proof was this, Eric?
That's 100 proof.
The 100?
And we actually go into the barrel at 109, but we felt like with the white, the 100 proof was nice in that some folks just don't enjoy higher proof whiskey, particularly white whiskey. And Dick, that was one of the could never fully understand about the evolution of the whiskey industry, was that they would occasionally lose barrels in their system. And whenever they had a barrel that went over 8 years old, they would sort of sheepishly blend it in with younger whiskey because nobody wanted whiskey that was aged that old, certainly not over 10 years. So when I think as Scotch became popular and single malt sort of influenced the American perception of what whiskey is, age statements certainly became older and it became a lot more important. But he could never get over the fact that people were drinking 15, 20, 23-year age whiskeys. Blew his mind. So it's so interesting how that perception or consumer demand changes. But we felt like the 100 proof was nice. It spoke to the folks that wanted slightly higher, but also if there were some folks that wanted to add a bit of water to open it up, they could still do so as well.
Yeah. Yeah, this is just fantastic stuff for sure. And I can't imagine for Dick Stoll, again, it's almost like going back in a time machine. You're talking about whiskey that hadn't been produced anymore, and to be able to go back and taste something from his past, it had to cause a flood of thoughts and emotions and everything else going on.
It
Not
and
that he was
it's
an emotional guy, but I mean,
no, and that's the
right,
thing. I'm sure inside he was
right,
weeping, and it just looked like he was just smiling and stoic and like,
right. Yeah,
super. That's just how he was. No, but it was the kind of thing too. Just seeing him that day, just the confidence and he always apologized that he couldn't lift more than the 50-pound bags, or that he couldn't do, or we attempted to explain to him that he had paid that forward many generations ago. But just to see the quiet confidence of him sitting there, and the media moving all around, me running around like my hair's on fire trying to get stuff done, and just that quiet confidence of him sitting there and tasting it was just really, I mentioned before I have a daughter, but up there amongst the greatest days of my life, without a doubt.
So Eric, was he with you when you started doing your early blends?
He was.
Okay,
was.
so and this is an interest. This is something I'm always very curious about. Like, it
Yeah.
seems to me like in the initial stages, when you're just starting out as a distiller, it must be so terrifying to have to make decisions about blends. Like, I mean, just to you've got to make decisions quickly, and every decision you make is going to cost you financially. So when you were first doing those blends, he was with you and guiding you, I'm imagining.
He was.
So I mean, what was that? I guess what I'm trying to ask is, what was that early blending process like as a young, or at least as somebody new to the, starting your own business and having to make decisions, important decisions about blends? How did you kind of grow into that, and what were your pitfalls?
Well, and it was the kind of thing for us where we would have never been crazy enough to do this without Dick. It was the kind of thing we wanted to do this, but to us, it was like, well, if Dick is in, then we're going to do this. If not, this is probably not the thing for us. So from the moment that I met him, he was so patient and so, but for those of you that have worked with me or that have spoken, I ask an inordinate amount of questions, just more questions than any human should ever be subjected to. But he was so patient and so kind and so, just as an example, when we were discussing barrel management and we got so granular with how full we should fill our barrels, how we should proof them, the rate at which we should, but talking to Dick about using basically radio tags to track barrels, and saying that if we have RFID tags and we get really good single barrels that come out of it, we should look at the data and then we'll replicate that with, and he looked at me and he's like, I'm sorry, what are you going to do with that? And he was probably 80 at the time. So I was like, okay, there's an 80-year-old gentleman. Let me explain to an octogenarian what an RFID tag is and how it would. So I did, and he very patiently listened and then said to me, no, I understand what you're saying. What you don't understand is what I'm saying. How are you going to replicate the changes in pressure, the changes in heat, the changes in, and I was like, oh my God, yes, 100. So for us, there wasn't a piece of plumbing in the distillery. There wasn't a bottle design. There wasn't a label design that he didn't have input on. I was raised to believe that if there's somebody smarter than you in the room, you should shut up and listen to them. So anytime Dick was in the room, that was the easy thing to do. And he was so humble and so insightful. And again, because he knew the distillery forwards and backwards, working with him to set up pumps or working with him to set up plumbing or how the boiler worked or where we should place certain things. He wasn't a distiller in a figurehead sense. He was a distiller in he ran the place sense, where at one point he was such a bad, again, such a good worker and such a bad negotiator that he once went to the CEO of the company and said, I need to resign as the head distiller because my maintenance duties are being neglected. And they were like, no, we can find someone else to do the maintenance
Yeah,
stuff. But that's how, that's his lack of ego, that he didn't care who was the head. He was still going to be doing everything anyway, but also knew that it's the fundamentals. The fundamentals matter. If you don't know how your boiler runs, how can you run your still effectively?
right.
then
But I mean, just to back it up a second, just so that everybody understands, right? And this is a super educated group, but I want to make sure that everyone understands what you were going through when you weren't making your own whiskey yet, and you were actually having to you were sourcing grain, right?
Yep.
Initially, and what it was like, how did that work? And just explain to everybody how it works, because this is an important part of every
Sure.
craft distiller's life and the whiskey that's in our glasses today. So I mean,
Yeah.
tell us how that happened, and who you went to, and how you ended up learning how to choose barrels quickly. I guess.
Sure. So, and that it's so sourcing is something that in Europe, because they never had prohibition, there's still a very proud tradition of sourcing and blending.
Yeah.
In the United States, it sort of fell by the wayside. And then with the craft distilling movement, there was a brief time in the beginning where if you sourced whiskey, you were seen as antithetical to the movement. And I think there were some folks who were maybe a little less honest than others in the beginning.
Yeah.
And eventually folks realized that, you know what, there's a lot of different steps to the process, and sourcing and blending is a huge skill that should be appreciated. So for us, in addition to saying Dick had to be in for us to move forward, my wife, being a much smarter person than I am, said, you know what, we need a proof of concept before we put every dollar we own into this slightly cockamamie idea, that people are actually going to be with us on this journey, and that they're going to be interested in this. So we actually Dick actually helped us reach out to some people in the industry, and our first barrels were sourced from NGP, and they're out in Indiana. There's a lot of folks that source from them. And when you get barrels from these various folks, they'll send you a lot, and they're little 2-ounce samples, and you have 24 hours basically to decide if you're going to buy 5 figures worth of whiskey, or it's gone.
I had no idea.
Yeah. So and that's if you can get it. So, and trying to get things that are older are in some cases next to impossible now. But for us, we rejected a lot of barrels, and sort of had the confidence to say when the right ones come along, we'll know, just to make sure, because Dick's thing was, you know what, I didn't return to this to not put out a quality product. I certainly never put out an inferior product before. I'm not going to put my name on the bottle and start now. So for us, it was definitely a sort of hold your breath kind of moment. And again, trust the process, trust Dick. So we got those initial barrels, and for us, it was a blend of bourbon. And then we were able to get some rye from, it's actually Death's Door by the name of Thomas McKenzie, was able to help us get those barrels.
Where were you aging your initial barrels before you got into the space where you are now?
So we were actually aging them. We had a barrel broker that actually held the barrels for us.
Oh, wow.
Because we literally didn't have the space.
Got it.
Then once we actually, to do our first blend, sorry, I'd forgotten a step. We actually worked with a local distillery, Thistlefinch Distillery, also in Lancaster County. And they were kind enough to let us use their facility to blend and bottle, and be able to do our first batch there. The thinking being that young rye ages out a little bit faster than bourbon. So the blend of a younger rye and an older bourbon for us was a nice blend, a nice sipping whiskey, and also
a May December relationship.
That's exactly it. Exactly. So, training wheels for folks that are they know they should get into rye, but aren't quite
Yeah.
ready to fully take the plunge. So
Exactly.
for us, it was a great first step, and it's the kind of thing that for us we've continued sourcing along the way, and we're actually going to be launching. This is sort of the first time we're discussing it outside of the distillery. We're going to be launching a Kindred Spirits line of source barrels that basically great stuff that we have access to as fellow whiskey geeks that we didn't produce, but is so awesome that we want to
Yeah.
help bring it to market. So
That's
we're
really,
excited about
You should give them a copy of my movie, Kindred Spirits, when you do that, by the way. Which is
Right?
an
Well,
actual
it's a
movie that we
package.
have. Yes. Yeah.
Oh, that's awesome.
Yeah. Yeah. That's cool. What do we want to try next? Which one do you want us to go to next, Eric?
So I believe the next one we have is our flagship rye.
Okay. All right. We'll grab that. That's what I would have done next too. But again, after we got through that Rosen, whatever you want. So, but that's exactly what I would have done too.
There's so many different ways to, and that's the fun thing about whiskey too. Dick always was such a huge proponent of geekery over snobbery, that however people want to do it is the right way.
Mm-hmm.
I'm
So
such a
this-
believer in that philosophy.
and this says 90 proof on this rye. And the fun thing with our rye, I'm sorry, Steve, I missed that.
That was not me. That was, I think, Leah clearing her throat, actually.
Oh, sorry. I should
Sorry about that.
myself on mute.
So this is a sweet mash rye, as are all of our ryes. Dick was a huge proponent of sweet mash. For those of you that aren't 100% sure what the difference between sweet and sour mash is, in sour mash, they realized that you can take up to 30% of what they call backset. So stillage that had previously been run, and add it to the mash, which is a fantastic way to make bourbon. For rye, especially in Eastern Pennsylvania, sweet mash was the tradition that was used. So we use fresh yeast every time, no backset. And Dick Stoll's mash bill and process, same one that was taught to him by Charlie Bean. And because we are in Eastern Pennsylvania rye, there's 30% corn in here, which the nice thing about the corn in this rye is that it adds a counterpoint to the rye. Sometimes when the mash bill is 80% or above rye, it can start to get a little bit more herbal. It can take on some more intense rye notes. With the corn, it adds a nice pop of caramel sweetness to the rye spice. And it's something that we're pretty proud of.
Yeah, it's dynamite on the nose for sure.
Are you what are you using? What size barrels are you using for this one,
So we're
Eric?
using 53 almost exclusively with these, and we're actually using Zach Cooperage barrels. One of the great things about Zach and what he's doing is using air dried staves. By air drying the stave, at least to our understanding, you're removing quite a bit of the tannin. And the hard thing with whiskey is obviously it improves in the barrel. And those tannins tend to come up and sort of become tamed over time. But if they never go into the whiskey, then taming them isn't quite as difficult. So that's the philosophy there. But I think it does show itself in the final product.
Yeah. Well, let's give this one a taste. Let's see what we got here. Here we go. Oh, wow, that's really nice. It starts out sweet.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah. Yeah, it's got some definitely the rice spice to it, and nice little hug there. So that's really good, my friend.
Oh, cheers. And hopefully a little bit of even cocoa and earthiness on the end. Also, Dick was a big proponent of building flavor as well, that when you drink whiskey, ideally it will have a beginning, a middle, and an end. And those three components don't necessarily have to be what you would think of as harmonious, but at the end of the day, if there's a synergy created there, then it's then it's well done.
Yeah. Yeah. Blueberry pie, says Mr. Whitlatch. I
Oh,
like
that's
that.
fantastic.
Mm-hmm. Any other notes anybody wants to share? This excellent cigar whiskey. Yeah, I could see that. Let's get the Robinsons. We'll pull them in here. Ask them. Or they usually like to share.
Also,
Robinsons.
something I would, excuse me, sorry about that.
Oh, I just want to get them to provide some notes here. Usually pretty good with these things.
I got some dark chocolate and like light tobacco on the finish. I really got like a lovely tobacco leaf finish. Which
And
We were gonna
I
say
mean that was
cocoa on the finish.
yeah.
Mhm.
Cheers.
Very
Well,
good.
and if folks are able to, I know sometimes with samples, it's hard to let them linger for too long, but it really does open quite a bit over time. So if you do have the chance to come back to them even in 10, 15, 20 minutes, it's amazing how much they really do open up.
Mm.
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely.
I
So
don't know if anyone else is getting a little bit of orange or a little bit of citrus as it opens as well.
yeah. Wowzers, that's good, my friend.
Oh, cheers. Thank you very
Yeah.
much.
Yeah. Yeah. Very, very good. All right. Next up, we want to go to the cask strength.
So with the cap strength, what we always tell folks is that, and again, I'm dating myself here, but Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young have beautiful harmonies and sing some amazing songs together.
Who?
Yeah, right. The Who were good too.
The who?
So,
Who are you
but-
talking about?
right? Young kids they play their cards right. But that said, each of them as a solo artist brings something very different to the picture. So there's the synergy of them together, yet on their own, they each have a very different energy. So with our single barrel series, what we try to do is when we're pulling barrels for our flagship product, when we get products that are unusual in a way that's good, we certainly don't want unusual, unpleasant, but when we get barrels that are outliers that are just fantastic, but have a slightly different character to them than our normal distillate, we like to try and release those for folks to try as well. And a lot of them we find at cask strength are really kind of exciting. And we get folks that tell us when they come into the tasting room that they do not like whiskey. And invariably, the cask strength is what speaks to them most. I'm not sure if the increased alcohol anesthetizes their tongue. Some folks say that the lower the proof in alcohol is, it shows more flaws. So maybe it's the higher proof is hiding flaws that we don't know about. But it's really interesting to see folks interact with it and appreciate it.
Mm.
Yeah. Well, let's give this cask strength a taste and see what we got going on here. Here we go. Again, cheers, gang.
Cheers.
What's the proof on this one? Eric, do you know that we don't have the proof on listed on the label? What do you remember the proof of this
I
one?
believe the proof is close to 115 because
kidding me?
Yeah,
Wow.
because we go in at 109 and our humid climate, we don't these barrels aren't all that old. Yeah, it's amazing.
This is dangerous, my friend. This is one of those that you could just drink one glass after, not even know until you go to make that step to get up, and then that'll hit you. But yeah, wow.
And it's interesting because that juicy fruit seems to be so amped up in here. I don't know if anyone else gets a little bit of gingerbread as well.
Eric Johnson said that, our other Eric on there said it right away. A lot of juicy fruit. So yeah. It's there.
Oh, cheers. Well, and particularly the cask strength. I don't know if folks happen to have any water on hand, but just a single drop really does break the surface tension and open it up quite a bit as well. But it really is sort of our flagship product, almost dialed to 11.
Mm.
Mhm. Yeah.
And also in an old fashioned or a Manhattan or any of the classic cocktails, it really holds up nicely as well.
How old, what's the age statement on this, Eric?
That's only 18 months.
Really?
Wow, impressive. In a 53-gallon barrel?
It is, yeah. The Zach barrels, there's definitely some magic happening in those. They really do some great stuff.
Yeah. Yeah. How long are they air seasoned? Because I know
So-
Zach does everything from up to 8 years even. So how much are
He
they?
does. I wish he had more of the 8-year, but I can't
Yeah.
blame him for not. That's
It's a long time to wait, right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
it really is. We find the 2-year for us is both from a flavor standpoint and from something we can get our hands on regularly is a sweet spot for us.
Hmm.
Where is that?
Zach Cooperage,
Yeah.
they are down in Kentucky. I believe they are about an hour from Owensboro.
Oh, how interesting. So is that where you get all your barrels from, or just
It
this?
is, yeah.
It
They,
is. Oh my gosh, how interesting.
so
That's what Royce uses too, by chance, Eric. So he's a big Zach Cooperage guy.
Are they all, is everything air dried there?
They're
to
on
my
the
knowledge,
LaRue County, Nelson County line in Athertonville, Kentucky, in the old Seagram's. It's actually an old Seagram's distillery.
Oh, wow.
That, big Cooperage in now.
Oh, wow.
It's where it's where Abraham Lincoln's.
I think he cut out there. Sorry.
The
Um,
8-year season
sounded
barrel is
like it was
actually
gonna
what
be
the
a good
Rosen went
story.
into.
Is it?
yeah, we can get our hands on one of those. The
Oh,
8
okay.
season was what the Rosen was aged in.
Yes.
Oh, very cool.
Wow.
And I'm sorry,
Um,
Royce, correct me if I'm wrong, but Zach is probably in his 30s.
Yeah, he's a young guy, and he's tough to get a hold of. Man, he's busy. We want to get him to come on the show and stuff, but we can never book him.
That's the hardest thing is he's milling, he's building barrels, he's doing, I mean, he's really he's a force. We're thankful that we're able to work with him.
Yeah. 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 Royce, like I said, uses those 8-year air season too. And yeah, you can really tell a difference on the whiskeys that he does in those versus he doesn't. I mean, it's good anyway, but it just takes it to that next level. It's just really, really good stuff.
It really does. And we always joke that our boiler tech and our Cooper are like, I mean, like they used to say, if you have a sports car, you really need to be good friends with your mechanic. For us, our Cooper and our boiler tech are the axis on which our distillery spit. So
Yeah. Yeah.
You know, I don't know if it's just me, but on my palate for that one, I got a strong finish of like black licorice, which I adore, by
Yeah.
the way. And I just like stood out for me so much.
That's so interesting. It's so fun to hear the things that folks get out of the whiskey, and also even as folks taste. I know we discuss certain flavors. There's the note, and then there's the resonance that continues after the note, where there's just sort of a faint ghost of that note, and as it overlaps with other notes in their beginning and end. So it's so
Yeah.
fascinating to hear what other folks get, and even just to see how those different flavors are appearing and disappearing for folks as well.
Yeah, I mean, it's almost like a lingering note of dark black licorice. I got a little bit of rosemary on the final finish. Don't know why. Maybe
that's
my Scandinavian heritage that's talking to me here, but I love that. Thank
It's
you,
so
Eric.
clean.
So beautiful.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. Yeah, and even I don't know if it's a local thing or not, but the molasses cookies, do they make molasses sugar cookies other places?
Oh, yeah,
Well,
yeah.
I can get German molasses cookies in my local bodega in Brooklyn.
Oh, that's fantastic.
And this totally reminds me of that as well. So
That's cool.
really
Eric,
nice.
before we move on to our last one, which is almost feels like a dessert one after the whiskeys we drank, tell us a little bit about where they can get your products, because I think the audience here is interested. Of course, we post these to YouTube as well. Is it just Pennsylvania? Is it just out of the distillery? Do you do any mail order? Anything like that? Any partners that ship it around? So tell us a little bit before we try the last one here.
Sure. So we've been very blessed to have a lot of demand for our products in state. So we're mostly in Pennsylvania right now. We do have a
Okay.
little bit of distribution in California, and a little bit out of New York, I believe through 4whiskeylovers.com. But it's definitely something we're working on changing. We actually are just about to increase the size of our mash cooker, so we'll be able to double our capacity from about 4 barrels a week to closer to 8 barrels a week. So we're very excited about that. And starting in, fingers crossed, September of next year, we should be able to move to all 2-year rye that's being released. A little bit of some younger releases of some fun stuff, but our flagship will be moving to a 2-year by that point. So
Yeah.
definitely some fun stuff in store, but right now, slightly limited distribution available through our website in Pennsylvania, and in about 20 different state stores throughout the state as well.
Okay.
And are all your barrels at the place in Lidditz that I saw right now, or are
So
they
we
kind of scattered around?
We actually purchased the building that we were in, and we're actually taking over barn space. There's no shortage of barn space in our area,
Yay.
thankfully.
It's good to hear.
Yeah, we actually, it was funny, whiskey author and historian Lou Bryson at a dinner we attended.
Nice.
Lou's great. He asked one of the Scottish distillers what the biggest change in their lifetime was, and they said forklifts. And for us, we just got a straddle stacker, sort of a
Oh
mini
my God.
forklift. So,
Right.
oh man, we'll actually be able to start going more than 3 barrels high, which for our world is very exciting.
Mm.
Heck yeah. Yeah. All right.
Good.
Well, let's pour this Pennsylvania apple brandy. Tell us a little bit about this one.
Yes.
The exciting thing about apple brandy is just how much terroir it can show, just how much of a sense of place, and the specific apples themselves. And it's so interesting. Apples are so evocative of America, and apple brandy is such an American thing. And it wasn't until we started producing apple brandy that we understood why there's so little of it. And that's because it takes an incredible amount of apples to actually make apple brandy. So you start with 10,000 pounds of apples, which will yield approximately 1,000 gallons of apple cider. And from that 1,000 gallons of apple cider, you'll get about 100 gallons
Holy
of
cow.
apple brandy. So that's 10,000 pounds of apples to 100 gallons of apple brandy. So it's one of those things where it really, I think for the distilleries that do produce it, it has to be the labor of love. It's not something that anyone is certainly going to get rich off of doing, but for us to be able to revive that bit of history is really exciting. Our distillery is actually on land that was apple orchard back in the early 1700s. My family was in Lancaster 1940s. There weren't a whole lot of people there then, and you married the people you went to church with. Everybody had a lot of children. So we're all sort of interrelated from that time period. Part of why I went to Brooklyn to meet my wife, make sure that we weren't cousins. But that said, a very strong, I'm only partially kidding there. Laura knows that. So that said, such a rich history of apple production in our area. And then just down the road from us is an Amish farm where we are able to get our cider from. We went to pick up cider at one point and ended up leaving with a German Shepherd puppy who is sleeping somewhere over there. So we get many things from them, but they're fantastic. And the exciting thing with them is they take all of their seconds and press them for us. And what we're able to do is they're Amish, but they do have a giant walk-in cooler in their barn. So the nice thing for us is we're able to press and then actually let wild yeast work for the first 3 to 4 days in that walk-in cooler. And then we come in and pitch our own yeast on top of that. But to be able to get a little bit of that wild fermentation happening, in addition to what we're able to do is pretty exciting. And then we're basically trying to, and again, I'm borrowing this concept from Thomas Mackenzie, but essentially rebuilding or attempting to rebuild the apple back in the bottle. So when you taste an apple, and like I was mentioning with other flavors, we talk about apple flavor as a monolith, but the skin has a certain flavor, the flesh has a certain flavor. The variety of apple has a huge influence on the flavor. So for us, what we're hoping to recreate is that experience of eating an apple, but in liquid form. And there's very rich apple brandy traditions in Europe, very different styles of apples, very different styles of stills, very, very different process. So with this, it's very fun to be part of bringing back American apple brandy. And also for us, it was the only product that we got to work with Dick on that he had never distilled before. So he had made rye whiskey before, he made bourbon before, he made corn whiskey before. Making those with him was all fantastic. But to be able to sit down with him and start from scratch with something like apple brandy was really, really fun. And now he had made it as a hobbyist, let's say, with his father when he was younger, but never on a commercial scale. So again, for us to be able to create that recipe together and create that process together was a lot of fun to be able to have input on something from the beginning.
Wonderful.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, let's give this thing a taste. I've been nosing it. I could nose it all night, but I do want to try it here. So one last time, cheers for Mr. Dick Stoll. And let's give this thing a taste.
Everybody.
Cheers, everybody.
Hmm.
Oh, wow. That is good.
Hmm.
You nailed it, my friend.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
You think that natural fermentation that you're doing in the fridge, that walk-in, is contributing to these butter notes?
Yes, and that's exactly what we're going for. Thank you very much. That buttery sort of. It's interesting how butter and caramel the flavors are so closely related. So yes, we were hoping to amp up the buttery flavor to sort of create some of that caramel custard sort of flavor as well.
So rich.
Thank you very much. And this is why distillers are so superstitious, because I think 3 to 4 days in the walk-in does that. I could totally be wrong. Maybe it's the container he presses it into every time that has some of that wild yeast in it that's actually doing it, but it comes out this way. And I think it contributes to it. So that's, again, that's how that sort of superstition comes about, where you control so many variables and you have so little control over others that once you find something that works, you just kind of stick with it. And for us, with the apple brandy also, we proof at a very different rate than we do our other spirits. That is sort of the one thing we borrow from the European tradition. There's a lot of attention in European brandies paid to the rate at the proofing happens and some of those chemical reactions happen. So
Why is that, Eric?
So and Eric J, it's like you're inside my head with the juicy fruit thing and the used rye barrel. So we do have some, and not to tempt anybody too badly with something that you don't have, but this
But you're going to do exactly that. Yes.
in a used rye
You're already
barrel. So,
tempted us.
another reason for us to all get together another time and do another one, but we do have some in rye barrels, some in used bourbon barrels,
Okay.
as well. So, and that's the fun thing with playing with used cooperage is all used rye barrels aren't equal. Some that we get have this really intense banana bread sort of smell to them. Those we kind of try to set aside and use for the apple brandy. And look for some of the barrels that really have some nice complementary flavors to what we're looking to amp up. So, and that's the interesting thing also with apple brandy is there's so many, as there should be, rigid classifications for bourbon, for rye, for a lot of other spirits in the United States. Apple brandy is very, very wide open in that way. The way that it's aged, the amount of time, obviously straight and bonded are still fall under the same criteria, but it's very, I'm sorry, we've got a visitor here who's insisting that he be recognized. So I apologize for that, but
What's his name or her name?
He's Luca.
Hi, Luca.
He's like, no food here. I'm on to the next thing. So anyway, if you see a giant German Shepherd come bounding in, chasing him like a cartoon, forgive me, but I think we should.
So, Eric, just not to backtrack, but just wanted to. Your product is so mind-blowing. It's amazing.
Oh, it's very kind of you.
Such a supporter of it. It's an amazing and beautiful product, and I can't tell you enough how much I love it. But I wanted to sort of talk to everyone while you're here about what it's like fermenting the rye, because I've heard that rye is difficult in the fermenting process. Like it's not an easy grain to grow. It's not an easy grain to kind of put in your fermenting tanks, and also wanted to just tag team on you a little bit about that, about how the US actually subsidized corn after Prohibition and made corn much more easy to grow, and how that sort of killed rye, and how you're doing a great thing by bringing it back.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, and it's so interesting with so much of the rye production prior to Prohibition. Again, distilleries use a lot of grain, and they can afford to buy grain at a decent price. So that going away was I think very difficult to a lot of the farmers. And if there's no market for something, farmers will grow whatever you want and whatever people are willing to buy. But for them, being out in the field isn't an exercise in growing things. It's to develop a saleable commodity.
Right.
And rye is one of those things where it's so interesting. As craft distillers, many of us try to look back on historical information that we can glean, maybe tips or tricks or some things where maybe large scale production lost a little bit of flavor. And they do a great job at producing large scale, but maybe there's something smaller that they missed out on. And from what I've read, it seems like they didn't fully understand the alpha and beta glucan in rye prior to Prohibition. So a lot of the distillers that were working with it, there are accounts of rye mash rising 6 feet in the fermenter, which for those of you that aren't familiar, that's unbelievable. And that also means that your fermenters
sorry, Eric. Say that again.
So there are accounts prior to Prohibition of rye mash rising 6 feet in the fermenter. And just because of the glucans in there, the stickiness of the rye and the way it builds up onto itself.
Yeah.
So I always say that rye is made out of distillers' tears. So it's the kind of thing where it can be very, very difficult to work with. One of the engineers that we're speaking with to develop our new mash cooker has a ridiculously accomplished set of formulas that he runs everything through. And we asked him if there's any deviation between the theory and the practice. And he said that there rarely is. And if there's ever any deviation between the formulas and the outcome, they know it's just based on rye whiskey. So it's one of those things where rye gets a lot of, rightfully so.
It gets a lot of fat.
It really does. And we use enzymes in our rye to help break down some of those as well. I know there are a lot of folks out there who do also. And it's one of those things where some folks feel like using enzymes is cheating. And that maybe in the past it hadn't been done that way. But as we always discuss, the people who were making whiskey in the past weren't looking to make it as difficultly as possible. They were looking to make as much whiskey that was as flavorful as possible, as efficiently as possible. So for us, being able to use enzymes in the rye not only helps us to be able to mash it more efficiently, but I think also enables us to probably extract a little bit more flavor and more fully break down that rye grain as well.
Yeah, well, it's
So
it's
it
hard,
definitely
it's obviously harder to work with. I mean, I've seen it in the tanks, and when
It can really-
when I did see rye fermenting in tanks, it seemed like it was literally trying to crawl out of the tanks. It
can
was
be a
so
nightmare.
alive. It was like, I'm coming to get you. It wasn't soft and bubbly like corn.
Yeah.
And just apropos of nothing, I think that may have to do with the division between the southern and northern tastes in both food and whiskey. So when you move
And I
farther
think
south, you like sweeter profiles and sweeter palates, and that's where the bourbon comes in. And in the Northeast, we always like to kind of spicier notes.
No, it's very interesting, and even the climate difference as well, and the way
Yeah.
that things can taste differently in a hotter or cooler climate,
Right.
without a doubt. And to your point earlier, coming out of World War II, there were government subsidies, I believe through the Nixon administration, where
Yes.
they would encourage people to plant fence row to fence row of corn. And
Right.
corn, for those of you that don't live in an agricultural area like we do, just to imagine an ear of corn is let's say about this big. A head of rye is this big. So when you start to look at the yields of them, again, a modern field in our area with genetically modified corn can do upwards of 200 to 300 bushels of corn per acre, where rye is a different animal. And when you go to talk to local farmers and ask them what the yield is, they don't even know because they've been plowing it under for so long. So
Right.
it's so interesting to even sort of establish that with them and get them in sort of these new habits, because a lot of farmers are not they're traditionalists, which is part of what they love about farming. It's very rare that you meet a cutting edge farmer or somebody who's and there
Hey.
are those folks. No. But you know what I mean, though. A lot of those folks have to do the research and then pass it on to the farmers, because the farmers can't afford to have a crop that maybe didn't provide them with the same amount.
Right. Well, I mean,
having a farm
this is, I mean, it's such a large subject, and it's a subject probably larger than whiskey. But I think what I'm happy about is that whiskey and farming is becoming a joint conversation. Finally, thank God.
Amen.
It's so true. And as one of the test,
And that all distillers such as yourself, and thank you, Eric, for doing so much to kind of bring the farmer perspective into your world.
no,
These things are intertwined and always have been historically.
no, and
From
historically
day
the-
one. So
the farmers were the distillers, and then the millers were the distillers, and it was, again, just part of that agricultural process.
yes.
Well, let's open it up for questions. If anybody here has a question, we don't want to go too long. We like to be respectful for our guests' time, but we do like to leave a little bit of time here at the end to ask some questions. So if you've got a question, open up your mic. Feel free to ask away.
Eric, I got a couple of questions. Number one, how much of the apple do you use when you make the brandy?
That's a great question. So I'm sorry, it broke up for 1 second. Just to repeat, to make sure I'm answering.
How much of the apple do you use
when
when you make the brandy?
So when they press the apples, they actually use a frame press. And to your question, I've asked them, in grape brandy production, there's a type of brandy called Mark, where they'll take the already pressed seeds, skins,
Yeah.
stems, everything else,
Yeah.
add some water and repress. It wasn't even worth doing that with the apple. It's crushed so much. So we're actually the skin, the flesh is not actually physically in there except as particulate because of the press. So we are using 100% of the juice in the apple, and there is quite a bit of solids that make it through. So
From
the
the
bottom of our
skin and seeds and everything else, yeah.
Oh yeah, the dregs
it's
at the
fresh.
bottom of our fermenter when we're done are so thick and so thick and funky.
Yeah.
That,
You're doing it right.
thank you so
You're
much.
doing it right.
We wish we
The
could
other-
get our hand on some sharps or some European style crab apples, but that's a little further in the future.
Yeah. And the other thing is, Steve can tell you, one of my favorite ryes is 5 years old. It comes from a small distillery in downtown St. Louis.
Yeah.
But then I got a hold of Leopold's Three Chamber, and that was friggin' phenomenal.
It's a different animal. It's
And now I'm drinking yours. What you
Oh,
are doing
man.
is fantastic. This
Oh.
Rosen White Dog is some of the best white dog I've ever had.
it's fantastic.
Thank you
Anyway,
so much.
Anyway,
That guy's
Oh,
called the legend, by the way. That's not
yeah,
just anybody's.
and
That's the
two
legend.
ryes, your flagship stuff, are phenomenal.
Oh, thank you so much.
I wish I could find them on the shelf in St. Louis.
Oh man.
When I open my liquor store, Eric,
Yeah.
you got to be in that store. That's your second state.
There you
in
go.
Missouri. You're in
Oh,
Pennsylvania
and
and
your
Missouri.
brandy is, like I said, you're doing it right. That's why I asked the question, because it's really good.
Oh, thank you so much. Anytime we get to be mentioned in the same sentence with Todd Leopold and he's such
Yeah.
a student of
And I have a lot of respect for any craft distiller that makes rye whiskey,
oh, thank
because
you.
because I know a guy that makes rye whiskey in St. Louis. I know what a pain in the ass it is to make. It's not an easy thing to do. So
Oh,
know.
thank you. Thank
Yeah.
you. We're too dumb to know otherwise, but it's
but it-
for us.
for the people that do it, it's an act of love, and they really put their heart into it, and it turns out good.
Oh, thank you so much. I really appreciate that.
Other questions? I got a question for Brad Mitchell. I'm going to ask him to unmute here. So normally we don't ask our attendees, but Brad, usually your wife Sally's with you. She has girls' night out. Did you save half the samples for her, or is she going to come home and these things are all gone?
Just made a pretzel. I'm trying to save them.
Right. I'm going through mine. They're just about.
I was
gone.
just going to say,
I-
Brad,
I
you're not going to
almost-
succeed.
Yeah, I almost invited a friend over, thinking I could split these. Obviously me and my friend are going to drink out of the same glass like Sal and I do, but yeah, I'm gonna save them for her because I think they're really
They're
good.
pretty special.
I think
Yeah.
Yeah, I think she'll
I
like
wish
them.
I'd bought 3 tickets.
Yeah. Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. What else you guys want to know? Either for Eric or for Laura, if you want to know a little bit more about the Rosen Rye, feel free to ask her as well. So Laura also, I mean, she's a pretty important person. She started the American Whiskey Convention, which is pretty cool. So if you're in the Northeast and you want to go up there for that,
There's that glass, Steve.
yeah, the glass is amazing. I love that glass. It feels so good in your hand. It's just heavy. It's weighted. It's just perfect.
I'll have to get you some.
Yeah, I love them for sure.
I have a question, just Eric, real quick, because I know you didn't touch on this. What is it about your still specifically in its connection to Pennsylvania? I mean, I know the answer to this, but I want you to tell everybody how
Sure. No,
special yours-
thank you.
your still is.
Sure. So we're actually we use we cheat and we use very modern technology at our distillery. The technology that we're cheating by using was from the 1860s. So we use a column still. And it's interesting. Again, in the beginning of the craft movement, column stills were almost seen as antithetical or almost when Dylan plugged in and went electric. The way some folks thought that he was sort of corrupting the movement. And it's so interesting how now you start to see more and more craft distilleries start to adopt the column. And it's one of those pieces of equipment that in some ways is misunderstood. some folks see a column and think big industrial whiskey production, but it's almost like an electric guitar in that you could play Eruption by Eddie Van Halen, but you can also play, more soulful sort of blues as well. So for us, we run our column very, very hard, for lack of a better term. We're only coming off the column at 100 proof. So for us, the column is basically getting us off the grain and giving us a chance to really get some really nice Maillard reaction and some good extraction out of there. And then we go into a doubler, a copper pot still, to really get more copper contact. And as Dick used to say, to sort of polish and refine the spirit. So for us, it's the kind of thing where Dick helped design every aspect of the still. And I think for us, it gives us a lot of different control and a lot of ability to fine tune the different spirits. So running something like rye whiskey on the grain or apple brandy through the same piece of equipment can be a bit of a challenge, but because of the way the still is set up and because of the way it's tuned, it gives us immense amount of flexibility and also repeatability with the still. That we liken a column still to cooking with a stove as opposed to cooking over an open hearth. Open hearth is fantastic. You get some very unique flavors, but it's much harder to control an open hearth than it is to cook over a stove where you have that ability to dial those temperatures in. That said, with somebody like Royce operating a pot still, it's in a master's hands. Pot stills make amazing whiskey, but for the style of whiskey that we make and the size of our operation, we're very thankful that that's come off the still very low. We're coming off mid to lower 130s. So yeah.
Oh,
Yeah, I just also want to point out that is historically very much a Pennsylvania tradition to have that doubler, regardless of what type of still, whether it was a
Right.
3-chamber, whether it was, 5-chamber, whatever it was, there was always that doubler there as well. So the fact that Eric is doing that is very traditional in the Pennsylvania whiskey.
That's what Dick did at Michter's. I mean,
That's right.
yeah, it's the exact same thing he did there. So yeah, I can see absolutely why you'd want to do that, where we're at now. So very cool. Any other questions? Well, let's hear it from my co-host Leah here. She did a great job.
Yeah,
Thanks,
thank
Leah.
you. Thank you.
Thank you,
Yeah,
Leah.
I know the whole time we've been talking about this, I've sort of been picturing these big steam belching factories in Pittsburgh in the 19th century. You know what I'm saying? So, not to kind of downplay the whole farm to table movement, but in fact, we have to also respect in a way that in the Northeast of America, there were huge, it was the industrial age, and there were big, huge factories pumping out millions and millions of gallons of whiskey in the Northeast. And also, in Brooklyn, where I live, which made more whiskey than probably anywhere else in the U.S. in the 19th century. It's something to kind of take into consideration. Like we have to kind of think about that when we also think about our trajectory as where we are making our whiskey, and not kind of knock the big industrial outfits so much. There were huge, for instance, there were huge distilleries in Brooklyn in the 19th century, pumping out millions and millions of gallons of whiskey. And it was all because of the industrial age. And that's not a bad thing necessarily.
The same holds true today.
Well,
Your big distilleries, are
Buffalo
making great
Trace is
whiskey.
bigger.
Buffalo Trace does a great job, as does the craft distillery. So it's still the same thing. That as much as things change, they stay exactly the same, and that's how it is today.
Exactly. So
Yeah,
I'm just
yeah.
trying to say that, as much as big distilleries were burgeoning in Brooklyn, they were burgeoning in Pittsburgh and the whole industrial
St. Louis. Yes.
steel mills and
Yeah.
and things like that. So
Well, let's hear it for Laura Fields as well for joining us. Laura, thank you so much.
Thank
Join
you,
us,
my
tell us a
pleasure.
little bit about Rose and Rye. That's an amazing story. And last but not least, let's hear it for Mr. Eric Wolf. Hello, Eric. Eric. And I'm not going to let you go, Eric, without giving you a personal thank you, because I say this: if Dick Stoll had done what he did in Kentucky, he would be one of the all-time great legends. He would be a guy that
Damn
would be
straight.
not forgotten. Would we, with his passing, he'd be up there with the all-time greats. He would have been one of the greatest living distillers during this resurgence with you, right along the lines with Jimmy Russell and all that. But largely, he would have been forgotten. That you gave him the second life and also put him back in the national pedestal, and we really appreciate that. And that's a real testament to you. And his legacy goes on from what you're going to be doing from this point forward. So one last round of applause for Eric Wolf again. And also out of respect for Mr. Dick Stoll, someone that I have the utmost respect for, just the short time I got to meet him. So with that,
Thank you.
we're going to say goodbye. Eric, thank you so much again. And I'll stick around. I always like to stick around after these. If you have any questions,
Yeah.
you want to talk a little whiskey. But again, out of respect for our guest time, we like to go ahead and turn the recorder off and say goodbye to our YouTube folks. So thanks a lot, guys. See you
Have a good one.
later.
Thanks.
Bye.